In 1964, America fell in love with a family of monsters who thought they were the normal ones. It was a comedy, yes. But here's the thing, the laughter you heard on that track often masked a reality that was far more grim. Behind Herman's booming laugh and Lily's graceful glide lay a production that was physically brutal, professionally suffocating, and financially hollow. We're talking about a lead actor trapped in a 50-pound rubber suit that was literally boiling his skin, a Hollywood queen who sacrificed her beauty for a wig, and a rivalry with the Addams family that was more like a bloodbath. You think you know the Munsters? You don't. Today, we're peeling back the cobwebs to reveal the ghosts that 1313 Mockingbird Lane tried to keep buried. Let's head into the fog where being different was the only way to survive. Chapter 15. The Ghost in the Typewriter. The Phoebe Munster secret. Imagine you've spent months building a world. You've found your perfect leading man in Gwynne, and you've shot a pilot episode titled My Fair Munster. But there's one problem. It's in color. And more importantly, the woman standing next to Herman isn't the Lily Munster we all know and love. Her name was Joan Marshall. In the original unaired pilot, she played Phoebe, a version of the Munster matriarch that was, well, let's just say she was a bit more lethal. While Lily was warm and motherly, Phoebe was sharp vampy and a little too close to home. You see, there was another spooky family brewing over at ABC, the Addams family. The executives at CBS took one look at Joan Marshall's Phoebe and panicked. She looked almost identical to Carolyn Jones's Morticia Addams. She was too dark, too seductive. They didn't want a vixen. They wanted a mother who happened to be undead. So Joan Marshall was quietly let go, and her performance was buried in the vaults, a ghost of a version of the show that almost was. And if you think that's weird, wait until you hear about the original Eddie. Happy Durman played him as a snarling, aggressive little wolf boy. He was so animalistic that test audiences were actually uncomfortable. It makes you wonder if they hadn't brought in Yvonne Carlo and Butch Patrick to soften the edges, would the Munsters have survived more than a week? Probably not. 14. The 40-pound prison. Gwynne's daily ordeal. Herman Munster was a giant of a man with a heart of gold, but for actor Gwynne, playing him was a literal physical nightmare. Standing 6'5" in his socks, Gwynne was already a presence. But to become Herman, he had to be bolted into 5-inch asphalt spreader boots that weighed nearly 10 pounds each. Then came the foam rubber. He was encased in 40 to 50 pounds of padding to give him that blocky Frankenstein silhouette. Now imagine being trapped inside that suit under the searing heat of 1960s studio lights. These weren't cool LED lights. They were massive heat-spitting monsters of their own. Within minutes, Gwynne would be drenched. It's been reported that he would lose up to 2 pounds of water weight every single day just from sweating. It got so bad that the production crew had to invent a makeshift cooling system. Between takes, they would take an air compressor and literally blow cold air up his sleeves and down his collar just so he wouldn't pass out. Imagine for a second being in his shoes, literally. Your back is screaming from the heavy boots, your skin is suffocating under layers of foam, and you still have to deliver a goofy, high-pitched laugh on cue. Gwynne wasn't just acting, he was surviving. 13. The $10,000 coffin, the midnight deal for Dragula. We all remember the Munster coach, but the real star of the garage was the Dragula grandpa's coffin-turned-race car. It's one of the most iconic vehicles in Hollywood history, but its origin story is straight out of a noir film. When the legendary car designer George Barris wanted to build a car out of a coffin, he hit a legal brick wall. In 1964 California, it was actually illegal for a private citizen to buy a coffin without a death certificate. I know it sounds ridiculous, right? But the law was the law. So how did they get it? Barris's project engineer Richard Corks had to resort to some under-the-table tactics. He found a funeral director in North Hollywood who was willing to play ball for a price. They made a secret deal. Corks would leave a pile of cash at the back door of the funeral home, and the director would accidentally leave a real fiberglass coffin outside after dark. It was a midnight heist for a prop. They literally smuggled a coffin into a workshop to build a piece of TV history. And that's not a replica you see on screen. It's a genuine vessel for the dead, modified with a Ford Mustang engine and organ pipe exhausts. Every time you saw Al Lewis screaming down the road in that thing he was sitting in, something that was never meant to hold the living. 12. The Green Skin Paradox. Why black and white was a blessing. If you ever visited the set of the Munsters, you would have been hit by a sight that was both hilarious and terrifying. The actors weren't monochrome. They were vibrant, almost neon. Because the show was filmed in black and white, the makeup artists had to experiment with colors that would pop correctly on grayscale film. The result, Fred Gwynne's face, wasn't gray. It was a bright, sickening shade of violet purple. Lily and Grandpa were painted in a ghostly, sickly green. The producers actually fought to have the show shot in color. The original pilot proves that. But CBS looked at the budget and realized it would cost an extra $10,000 per episode to go color. In 1964, that was a fortune. So they stayed in the shadows of black and white. But here's the irony: that budget cut is exactly what made the show a classic. The black and white cinematography gave it that universal horror atmosphere, a direct link to the 1930s Frankenstein and Dracula movies. If it had been in color from day one, it might have looked like a cheap cartoon. Instead, it felt like a dream or a beautiful nightmare. 11. Beverly Owen's Secret Tears. The Marilyn who didn't want to be there. Everyone remembers Marilyn Munster, the ugly duckling of the family who was actually a stunning blonde. But many fans don't realize that the first Marilyn Beverly Owen was living her own personal tragedy behind that perfect smile. Beverly didn't want the job. She was a New York actress deeply in love with a man named John Stone, who would later go on to help create Sesame Street. When she was forced to move to Los Angeles for the show, she was devastated. Imagine being 27 years old, separated from the person you love and trapped in a 7-year contract for a show you never wanted to do. By all accounts, Beverly was miserable. She was often seen running off the set in tears between takes. It was so bad that her co-stars Fred Gwynne and Al Lewis, who were like fathers to her, eventually stepped in. They saw this young woman's spirit breaking, and they did something incredibly rare in Hollywood. They marched into the producers' offices and demanded she be released from her contract. They told the studio that if they didn't let Beverly go home to her fiancé, they would walk too. That's the kind of family they were. Beverly left after just 13 episodes, replaced by Pat Priest. She got her happy ending, she married John, and left Hollywood behind. But for those first 13 weeks, every time you saw Marilyn smile, she was likely hiding a broken heart. 10. The Addams Rivalry. The Secret War for the Macabre. In the fall of 1964, something strange happened in American living rooms. Suddenly, monsters weren't just in the cinema. They were next door. But here's the thing, it wasn't a coincidence. It was a cold-blooded corporate race. While CBS was developing, the Munsters ABC was quietly working on the Addams Family. The two networks were like neighbors trying to outdo each other's Christmas lights, but with coffins and cobwebs instead of tinsel. ABC actually beat CBS to the punch, premiering The Addams Family just 6 days before the Munsters hit the air. Imagine the tension in the writer's room. Every time Morticia Addams did something iconic, the Munsters team felt the pressure to make Lily more relatable. The rivalry was so intense that the actors were often asked to comment on the other family in interviews. But despite the media trying to stir up a feud, the casts actually respected each other. They knew they were both fighting the same battle, trying to prove that being different could be profitable. Yet behind the scenes, the executives were playing a zero-sum game that would eventually lead to one family's demise. 9. Grandpa's Ageless Lie, The Mystery of Al Lewis. Al Lewis, with his cigar and his sarcasm, was the soul of the Munster household. As Grandpa, he was supposed to be the ancient, centuries-old patriarch, and in real life, he certainly looked the part. But if you look at the birth certificates, the math doesn't add up. For decades, Al Lewis claimed he was born in 1910. He told everyone he was 54 when the show started. But after he passed away, his own son discovered the truth. Al was actually born in 1923. He was only 41 years old when he started playing the grandfather of the family. Wait! It gets weirder. This means Al Lewis was actually 1 year younger than his on-screen daughter, Yvonne de Carlo. Can you even picture that he was wearing heavy prosthetics and white hair to play the father of a woman who was technically older than him? He lied about his age for years, fearing that if the producers knew how young he actually was, he'd lose the role of a lifetime. It was a performance within a performance, a man hiding his youth under layers of latex and a fake history. The makeup torture. Yvonne. De Carlo's fallen star. To the world, Yvonne de Carlo was Hollywood royalty. She had starred in the 10 Commandments. She was a goddess of the silver screen. So why did she agree to be painted green and tucked into a basement set for a sitcom? The truth is heartbreaking. By the mid-60s, Yvonne's husband, a stuntman named Bob Morgan, had been catastrophically injured. While filming How the West Was Won, he lost a leg and nearly died. The medical bills were mountainous, and the movie offers for a woman in her 40s were drying up. She didn't take the role of Lily Munster because she loved monsters. She took it to save her family from bankruptcy, but the price was physical. Her makeup was a heavy, pasty mask that took 3 hours to apply and an hour to scrub off with harsh chemicals. It irritated her skin and weighed down her spirit. She was a glamorous movie star who had to spend her days looking like a corpse just to keep the lights on at home. When you see Lily smiling at Herman, remember that behind those eyes was a woman carrying the weight of a real-life tragedy on her shoulders. The Batman. Curse How Color Killed the Munsters. By 1966, The Munsters was a hit. It was top of the ratings. And then everything changed. A man in a blue cape and yellow tights arrived, and he brought something the Munsters didn't have: color. When Batman premiered on ABC in 1966, it was a psychedelic explosion. It was campy. It was bright. And suddenly, the moody black and white world of 1313 Mockingbird Lane felt like a relic of the past. The audience's tastes shifted overnight. They didn't want the grainy shadows of old-school horror anymore. They wanted the neon BAM and POW of the Caped Crusader. The producers of The Munsters tried to pivot. They even released a color feature film, Munster Go Home, to prove they could compete. But it was too late. The Batman craze was a juggernaut that crushed everything in its path. CBS, fearing they looked old-fashioned compared to ABC's vibrant lineup, pulled the plug. The Munsters were cancelled not because people stopped loving them, but because the world had suddenly lost its taste for the shadows. 6. A Message in the Shadow. The civil rights subtext. We often think of The Munsters as just a silly comedy about a dragon under the stairs. But if you look closer, there was something much deeper and much more radical happening. The 1960s were a time of intense racial tension and the civil rights movement. And here were the Munsters, a family that looked frightening to their neighbors, yet were the most kind-hearted, law-abiding people in town. The joke was always that the normal people were the ones who were prejudiced and judgmental. Herman Munster once gave a speech to Eddie that still gives me chills. He said, "The motto of our family is, it doesn't matter what you look like. You can be tall or short or fat or thin, or ugly, or handsome, but what matters is the size of your heart and the strength of your character. In 1965, that wasn't just a sitcom line. It was a political statement. The show was teaching a generation of children to look past the monster on the outside and see the human on the inside. They were using the safety of comedy to deliver a message of tolerance that many news programs were too afraid to touch. 5. The Lost Treasures of 1313, the day the magic turned to trash. You'd think that a house as iconic as 1313 Mockingbird Lane would be preserved in a museum, wouldn't you? But Hollywood in the late 60s was a cold, unsentimental place. The moment the show was canceled, the gates of the Munster mansion didn't just close, they were torn open. Because the show was filmed on a studio backlot, the set was just inventory. Most of the custom-made props, the dusty artifacts Grandpa supposedly brought from Transylvania, and the intricate Gothic furniture were simply tossed into industrial dumpsters. Imagine the smell of sawdust and splintering wood as the wrecking ball of progress swung through their living room. Those iconic pieces of TV history were treated like surely garbage. A few lucky crew members managed to sneak out small items, but the vast majority of the Munsters' world vanished overnight. It's a haunting reminder of how fleeting fame is. One day, you're the most famous family in America, and the next your home is being hauled away to a landfill. If you ever see a piece of original Munsters memorabilia at an auction today, know that it's a miracle it survived the purge of 1966. The Forgotten Son. Butch Patrick's search for identity. Being a child star is never easy, but being Eddie Munster was a different kind of burden. Butch Patrick was just 11 years old when he put on the widow's peak and the velvet suit. To the world, he was the cute little werewolf boy. But to Butch, he was a kid who was losing his childhood one makeup session at a time. Imagine for a second being a preteen who can't go to the park or play with friends because your face is plastered on every lunchbox and comic book in the country, but people only love you when you look like a monster. After the show ended, Butch struggled to find out who he was without the ears and the fangs. The transition to adulthood was rocky, filled with the typical pitfalls of early fame, substance abuse, and a desperate search for a normal life. It took decades for Butch to finally embrace his legacy. For years he tried to run away from Eddie Munster, only to realize that the little boy in the velvet suit was the only thing the world wanted from him. It's a quiet tragedy, isn't it? To be loved by millions for a version of yourself that doesn't actually exist. Fred Gwynne's Post-Munster struggle, the ghost in the mirror. If you think Fred Gwynne walked away from the Munsters as a wealthy, happy man, you'd be wrong. In fact, for years he hated the very character that made him a legend. After the show was cancelled, Fred found himself in a terrifying position for an actor he was typecast. Every time he walked into an audition for a serious dramatic role, the casting directors couldn't see the talented Juilliard-trained actor. All they saw was Herman Munster. They expected him to do that high-pitched laugh. They couldn't take him seriously. Fred grew bitter. He retreated from Hollywood, moving back to New York to focus on writing and illustrating children's books, which he was incredibly talented at, by the way. He once famously walked out of an interview when someone asked him about Herman. He wanted to be an artist, a storyteller, a man of depth, but he was haunted by a ghost made of foam rubber and purple makeup. It wasn't until much later in life, particularly with his role in Pet Sematary and My Cousin Vinny, that the world finally saw the real Fred Gwynne. But those middle years, they were spent in a cold professional exile, fighting a monster he had created himself. 2. The reunion that broke hearts, trying to catch lightning in a jar. In the years following the cancellation, there were several attempts to bring the family back. There was The Munsters' Revenge in 1981 and various specials. But if you watch them, something feels off. The sets were brighter. The film stock was cheaper and the actors were older. You could see the lines under the makeup. You could hear the strain in their voices as they tried to recapture the magic of 1964. It's like watching a high school reunion, where everyone is trying to pretend they're still 17. The tragedy of these reunions wasn't that they were bad, it was that they proved you can never truly go home again. The world had changed. The 60s were gone, and the innocent, spooky charm of the original show felt out of place in the cynical 80s and 90s. The cast tried their best, but they were chasing shadows. It serves as a poignant lesson for all of us. Sometimes the most beautiful things are meant to stay in the past, preserved in the amber of our memories, rather than dragged out into the harsh light of a new day. 1. The final goodbye. The quiet exit of a giant. In 1993, the world lost Fred Gwynne to pancreatic cancer. He was only 66 years old, but the way he passed away tells you everything you need to know about the man behind the monster. He didn't want a Hollywood circus. He didn't want a star-studded funeral. He spent his final days on his farm in Maryland surrounded by his art and his family. He died quietly away from the flashing lights and the cameras. But here's the most touching part. Despite his years of resentment toward the character in his final years, Fred had finally made peace with Herman Munster. He realized that for millions of children who grew up feeling different, feeling like they didn't fit in, Herman was a hero. Herman was a father figure who taught them that you could be weird and still be worthy of love. When Fred passed, it wasn't just an actor dying, it was the end of an era of kindness. He was a man who spent his life hiding his brilliance and his pain under a mask, only to realize that the mask was what gave the world hope. So here we are at the end of Mockingbird Lane. We've seen the sweat inside the suit, the tears behind the Marilyn smile, and the struggle of a giant who just wanted to be seen for who he truly was. But why does the Munsters still matter 60 years later? Maybe it's because, in our own way, we're all a little bit like them. We all have parts of ourselves that we think are monstrous. We all have days where we feel like we're wearing 40 pounds of foam rubber just to get through the day. And we all just want a family that looks at our stitches and our scars and says, "You're perfect exactly as you are." The Munsters weren't a freak show. They were a mirror. And perhaps the greatest secret of all is that the house at 1313 wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was filled with the most human thing of all, unconditional love. What about you? Do you remember the first time you met Herman and Lily? Or maybe a moment from the show that stayed with you? Let's talk about it in the comments. Let's keep their memory alive. Because as long as we remember them, the lights at 1313 Mockingbird Lane will never truly go out.